This is Betsy Bula. She is the all remote evangelist at GitLab. And GitLab is a company of 1,300 people that's been remote for a long time before the pandemic. So you've got lots of lessons to share with us, I'm sure, today. I want to get started right off talking about sort of company culture. How do you sort of form a company culture and do that in a remote situation?
Absolutely. Thank you, John. So this is such an important topic because I think as many companies are emerging from the pandemic and figuring out what their workplace design is going to look like, culture is one of the biggest questions that we're hearing. So the GitLab team, as you mentioned, we've been all remote since 2015. So we've really had the time to intentionally invest in our culture and build it in a way that supports remote work. And it's something that companies are now trying to figure out. So much of culture for a co-located company that, historically leaned on things that were physical perks of the office, like, the ping pong tables and the vibe of being in the office and happy hours and things like that were suddenly stripped away in the past 15 months. And so really the only way to do that successfully in a sustainable way in a remote or a flexible or hybrid setting is to document it. And so for GitLab, our culture is equal to the values that we write down and how we live those out. And so our 6 core values are documented in full form in our company handbook, so anyone can view it. And that's something that, under each value, we have our sub values, which are substantiators. And those sub values outline every behavior that's associated with that value and really what that means to live that out in your daily work and how you interact with one another. So that's, not building culture around this one building or this one tangible object means that you can scale it and onboard people to it more easily. And it makes you more agile as a team to be able to share that as new people join, even if you're not in an office together.
Now, by being intentional about this, and we should say this is kind of a living, breathing document. It's not a static sort of guidebook, right?
Right.
Can you give me an example of some of the things that are sort of intentionally kind of laid out in this guidebook?
Absolutely.
In this sort of document?
The GitLab handbook is a fascinating thing. I'd encourage any of you to go look it up. It's publicly available. If it was printed, it would be more than 10,000 pages. So it is a huge, huge document. But it's something that is truly the guide for everything that we do. So at GitLab, every process, every way that we communicate, all of our tools, our culture, our practices for remote teams, all of it's documented in this handbook. So you can search at any given time. I'll mention throughout our session where you can find something on a handbook page in the GitLab handbook. And I'd encourage you to refer back to that because that's sort of how we operate. We don't expect everyone to know every detail of the 10,000 pages that's in that handbook, but we do want them to have sort of that self-service mindset where they know where they can find that information, whether someone's online or not, to ask about it. And we really encourage everyone to not only be part of updating that handbook and that they can contribute to it, but also that, we want to build those best practices in how we communicate with one another. So even things like responding with links to the handbook is considered a not only normal, but encouraged practice so that we're continuing to work handbook first. And it's really that living, breathing document, like you said.
So let's say I'm a new team leader at GitLab, and I'm having problems with a young staffer who's feeling a little disconnected. Are there, no one's trained in this sort of all remote management style. Are there places where I can go in this guidebook to help me with some strategies for reconnecting with this worker who's feeling a little out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would almost say that whatever you're wondering about with how to operate remotely, you'd find it in our handbook. But yes, there's a whole guide about not only how to manage in a remote team so that other companies can benefit from that, but also how GitLab does it, how we handle one-on-ones, how we want managers to address team members in one-on-one so that they're actually able to kind of pull out the important information about, what's going on with a team member. So in your example, being able to point out or figure out when someone's experiencing burnout or isolation or something like that is up to the manager. And so we enable them with this handbook with a full guide of how to ask the right questions to elicit that response, so that you're not just getting oh, I'm fine, and then moving on and not addressing a bigger problem. So like you said, not every manager that's from a co-located environment is going to be able to be a great manager in a remote environment without some training and some upskilling. And so that's really up to the organization and the leaders to kind of build in that learning and development and make sure that not only you're documenting these practices, but also as new managers are onboarding, you're making sure that they have some training and understand where those resources are and how they're expected to act as a manager. And we've documented a lot of the traits of a great remote manager as well. So it helps us as we're interviewing for people. We're looking for people who can build empathy across their team, build trust, have a bias for documentation, so that if they're offline in a different time zone from their team member, they're not a single source of failure. And really managing process instead of people is important too. If you've set out these processes, your people should be able to act, accordingly, whether you're online or not, to answer their questions.
Right. Now, how do you, if I'm this manager, how do you make sure that this sort of guidebook, and this is really like a one-stop shop for everything you want to know about operating within this company, right? It's not just a guidebook, it's a living, breathing document that's collaborative. If I'm a manager and I want to make some sort of notes or suggestions for if I've learned something about sort of managing my team, how do I go about sort of adding to this document?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, and I'll take a step back. That GitLab, the tool, is actually a tool for developers to build software in a single application. And we have, so many developers around the world use it for software development, but we at GitLab use it as a remote collaboration tool as well. And so we use our own product internally for updating the handbook, and that's how we make changes. So from day one, as you're onboarding at GitLab, you learn how to make a merge request, which is essentially a suggestion to change the handbook. And that's where we gather feedback about changes, leave notes, and there's this always a record of how something was decided, what that change might be. Even if the change was rejected, there's a documentation about that. So everything we try to gear towards the GitLab tool so that we're not kind of, splitting our work across multiple platforms. And that way you're able to, make changes and allow people to contribute to it virtually. So a manager, if they wanted to make a change, could go in, make a merge request, and then share it with their team. Or if it's something that the broader group should know about or have some kind of say in, they can share it more broadly with a larger group or the whole company even. And it gives people the opportunity to add in, more perspectives and get to a better outcome in the end, and a more well-rounded decision.
And you have some interesting stories about the collaboration that takes place on the platform as it relates to sort of formulating this culture and building on this sort of guidebook. It seems to be a very democratic thing, right? Like you can be the CEO and still get your ideas sort of shot down.
Yes. So there's a funny story about that I'll tell. Our CEO was suggesting a change to, how we, refer to our people. So for example, someone has suggested GitLabbers. There's lots of suggestions over the years. And so he made a suggestion via a merge request and shared it out to get feedback, and immediately got like 20 downvotes on that suggestion. And he took that, in such a positive way that was like, wow, my team is able to push back when they disagree with me and share their reasons why, and not feel that because I'm the CEO, they can't share their valid opinions. And so he even tweeted that out afterwards as an example to other leaders that was like, this is how this should be. There is, this doesn't mean that we want consensus on everything. So part of what's documented in our handbook is that we have DRIs, or directly responsible individuals, assigned to every project or every decision that we're going to make. And so that person is ultimately responsible for making the decision, but it requires a lot of feedback gathering and sharing out the process and being transparent about your work all along the way, so that in the end you reach a better decision, that you've done sort of the change management built into that decision making, and you're not just making a decision at the top and dropping it and hoping that it fits. So yeah, we've had some interesting, great opinions shared, and it ultimately meant that there's an outcome that's more widespreadly adopted across the team.
So it's all great that GitLab has this one source to go to, the sort of Bible for culture and management. You're talking to someone who, I met my wife on my first job out of college. I have some great friends who I'm still in touch with, who I worked with early in my career, who I just love. I learned so much about being a journalist by listening to the phone calls that reporters who were sitting next to me had, and by looking over their shoulder when they were sort of writing stories. How do you make sure that kind of like learning and informal mentorship and friendship and socialization happens in your 100% remote kind of culture?
Absolutely. That's such a great question. And it's one that we talk about a lot, because the bottom line is humans are social beings, and we're not meant to never see other people or interact with the people that we work with. And so it's important to know that there is a balance of in-person interactions, when we're not in a pandemic, that you can mix in to really have relationship building opportunities that will then enable your work when you're working remotely. So at GitLab, we have a number of ways that we do this. We get together every 9 months, typically, as a team somewhere in the world. And we have meetups that are with people who are located in the same region or near one another. We meet up at events. There's so many opportunities to do that relationship building. And we try not to work during those times that we're together. We really try to focus it on actually building rapport and getting to know each other as people. But in the everyday times, which, the last 15 months has been anything but normal for even those of us who have worked remotely for a long time. This has not been remote work. It's been forced work from home in a global pandemic. So we were very clear to lay that out at the beginning, and our leadership was very intentional about, understanding that even for us, there are lots of different things at play in the last 15 months that, can cause a lot of extra stress and duress on the team.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we do is document all of the ways that we manage informal communication, because when you're not in an office every day, you don't have those casual pass someone in the hallway chats, or like sitting, walking to coffee or walking to lunch. And so we try to be more intentional about setting up those moments for the team to get to know each other as people. And this was never more important than this past year. We even had some additions to that handbook page. And so I'd encourage you to look up GitLab Informal Communication Handbook, and you'll find all the examples that we have documented. But one of the ones that I love is we have typically coffee chats, which is what we have for team members to connect with one another. 30-minute session, talk about anything unrelated to work and just get to know each other. But during the pandemic, a lot of people were doing that less because they were trying to, they might have been caregivers or had children at home, or a roommate, or they were, totally alone. And so we had a couple of team members with children who decided, let's get our kids together on a Zoom and just let them have a coffee chat. And it became so popular, we actually added it to the handbook, and we've called them juice box chats. So it's when, team members' kids, or we've even had people's grandparents and all family members get involved. And it helped really build that connection and, take some of the stress away from this universal experience that we've all had in the past year. So I love that example, because it was something that came up because of a team member's example, and it's now, codified in our handbook as something that other teams can try out.
That's great to have a moment where you're not chasing your kids out of the room and
Yes,
telling people not to come in. Uh,
exactly.
so for the skeptics out there, can you tell me sort of how GitLab measures success? How do you know this is working? What are the gauges and uh, guideposts you use to know that you're getting this right?
So for GitLab, we do not ever measure the number of hours someone's working, whether they're online at a certain time. We believe in true autonomy, that we want people to work when is best for them. The bottom line is that when people were sitting in an office for 8 hours a day, they were not working every minute of that day. They have peak productivity times, they have other things going on in their lives. And so we allow people to work when and how and where they get their best work done. And we measure that by their results, not the hours put in. So part of it is that we have, company-wide goals like any team would. We have team level goals, and then we have individual objectives and key results that we outline for each individual as the quarter begins. And so those are things that they've documented, again, in the handbook and in the GitLab tool, so that everyone can see them and share them and understand what other teams are focused on. And everything that you do should theoretically be tied back to one of those goals. So if it's not, then you might ask the question, should we be focusing on something else this quarter? So that's really how we measure individual productivity. It's about what you're achieving, not when you're working on it and how you're working on it, or where. So that's really how we know overall that someone's being successful. And there are a lot of measures in the GitLab tool that show us, overall how many merge requests someone's making and things like that. So we actually use that as more of an example of, does someone need a break? Do they need to take some time off? Like their grid that shows their contributions is going through the weekends and all 7 days of the week. We need to kind of work with this person and help them take that break. That's actually how we determined at the beginning of the pandemic, our leadership team noticed that productivity chart was skyrocketing, and they had kind of, expected people have their children at home, they're locked down, they're under unprecedented levels of stress, like hopefully they'll take care of themselves, and that wasn't happening. So they actually saw that productivity level rising as an example or a reason that there needed to be some intervention. So our executive team started what we call Friends and Family Day, which was a day each month since last May that we shut down the virtual doors to the office, and everyone took the day off. And it really encourages everyone to remember to go out and do something outside of their work, whether it's just going to hang out with their kids or it's going to pursue a hobby that you love. That was kind of a forcing function to remind people how important that is. We have one this Friday. So we're continuing that because it's been so well received by the team and is helping people remember to take other time off in addition to those days. So those measures are so important, even just for maintaining like morale and your culture.
That's great. And you said GitLab's retention numbers are also pretty good, as well as diversity has been sort of improving, or diversity is sort of better compared to other companies in your sector?
So, I think diversity is a challenge for everyone, and we are still on a journey to, continue to build a more diverse team. I will say remote work in general allows companies to be more inclusive. People who typically would have to deal with a commute or who didn't have opportunities in the area that they live, they don't have to now relocate for an exciting career opportunity. They're able to drive their kids to school and then come back and have a big, busy work day at home or wherever they choose to work that day. So as far as the inclusivity factor, we have a lot of team members who are even military spouses who talk about how they've been able to continue to pursue a career even as they've had to relocate frequently because of remote work. So there are many factors that kind of are at play with that just in general, remote work allows more opportunity for people. And then there's also, it takes a lot of intention. So we don't just leave it at that. It's super important for us that diversity and inclusion and belonging are integrated into everything that we do. So we have a whole diversity, inclusion, and belonging team, and they oversee, kind of the structure of how all of that works at GitLab. So we have team member led resource groups for anything. I believe we have about 7 of them now. There's GitLab Pride group, there's GitLab Women group, there's a neurodiversity group, generational understanding. So any dimension of diversity you can think of, we're addressing internally to be sure that people from all walks of life feel included and also feel like they can bring their whole selves to work every day. And it even goes through to how we use our tools. So for example, Slack for us is really meant for that informal communication and allowing people to bring their full selves. So we have all these channels, even for our employee resource groups, where people can share thoughts and ideas and resources and even concerns. Like in our mental health aware channel, people will share issues that they're struggling with and have those open conversations. So I would argue that for me, it's the most inclusive environment I've ever been a part of. But that said, we're always improving. So iteration is one of our values, and we continue to iterate on all of that as well.
Yeah. Touching on something that Nick Bloom mentioned in the previous session. Are there any sort of learnings that people can take away from, like, things that, learning from are there ways that people here can learn from GitLab's mistakes? Are there any important mistakes that you made that people might have some takeaways on?
So one thing that, I think every company, remote or not, struggles with when you're across multiple time zones. And like you mentioned in the beginning, we have more than 1,300 team members across 65 countries around the world. So we are in almost every time zone. And one of the things we've struggled with is certainly how to be most inclusive of all time zones. So that's something we're always, again, iterating on and getting feedback from our team about what's best for them. How do we address that issue? One of the ways that we do that is asynchronous communication. So the idea is not everyone needs to be on every meeting, because we have documented all of it and they can access the agenda ahead of time. They can contribute asynchronously, and it does not require everyone to be on a Zoom call with the entire company when it's not going to work for every team member. So that's one that we still are trying to figure out, and we've documented some solutions to it, but we're learning from other people, and I think it's something that the whole world is going to continue just to work through and struggle with. But there's so many tools now that are enabling that asynchronous communication that I think it's something we're going to see really improve over the coming years. I think one of the biggest things is we've documented all of this so that other teams can benefit from it. And so the main landing page for all of our remote content is allremote.info. And there are more than 50 guides that are part of that remote work guide. And then we've also distilled all of that, the most important lessons, into our playbook. So you can download the playbook on that same URL. And that's really something that other teams are using as a blueprint for their remote transitions. So whether you are planning to go back into the office mostly, you're choosing a hybrid setting, or you're trying all remote, these practices are going to be helpful for any type of organizational design. So I'd encourage people to check that out. That's where we've really listed some of those lessons, and you can download it, share it with your team, and learn from it.
Betsy, we're going to have to wrap things up from there. Everyone, thank you so much. Betsy, thank you.